Good morning and welcome to Wellbeing Wednesday. I'm delighted today to be joined by David Todman, independent consultant, who at the grand old age of over 16, but only just, has recently been diagnosed with ADHD. Welcome, David. First of all, can you tell me a little bit about the symptoms around ADHD, because it goes a bit over and above the norm?
Well, contrary to common belief, it doesn't go away at 16 or 18. It is a neurodiversive condition, and it affects people in a lot of different ways. There's, as with anything of this nature, there's a wide sort of spectrum. But in general terms, I'd say the things to look out for, if you would, is probably difficulty in concentration. That's a fundamental. The hyperactivity thing can be much more in children than maybe in adults, but it can be something. You get very buzzy. People say, you get buzzy and excited. And the other one is the alternative of the difficulty in concentration is actually something called hyperfocus, which means you can get really locked into something to great detail and great time, and time passes and you suddenly realize that you've forgotten everything else. And
I mean, an example of that, you spoke about writing a dissertation, just like from beginning to end, 9 hours flat out.
Yeah, I mean, you can lock into it, and it can be a very positive thing. I mean, many years ago now, when I was doing my master's dissertation, I think it was 23,000 words, and a lot of research to do, and it was a little bit before the time of the internet per se, so you couldn't just go to libraries and all that stuff. But the writing of it, I in typical ADHD fashion, I kind of left it close to the deadline. That's another thing, executive functioning on deadlines. And so I literally had to sit down over probably 3 weekends and write it and put it together. So that hyper-focus element was useful to be able to get it done in the time.
But of course, at that time, ADHD wasn't on your radar, was it?
Well, my son was diagnosed at quite an early age with it, and for various reasons, I kind of not really considered it particularly. Career-wise, I was pretty successful. I was in a senior management role in an international function, expatriate roles, and things were good. And so it wasn't until maybe I had a bit of a career hiccup in my 50s when I moved out of a company I'd been with for a number of years to take a global marketing director's role, when things suddenly didn't start working for me. And I started to look inwards to think, what is it? What's happening to me? And then I realized what it was is when I was in my international role, traditionally, I was flying around country to country, working with different groups, different sales groups and marketing people over a number of countries. And that high energy thing worked great with ADHD because you've got that drive, you've got that thing that keeps you going. When I took the final role, the global marketing role, I was much more focused on spreadsheets and writing stuff and the routine elements of much more office-based. And of course, that doesn't lend itself particularly well. And suddenly I was faced with a change and I couldn't quite work it out. And so it triggered me to go look for what's happening here.
So you went to see your GP?
Yeah, I went to see my GP, and the GP said, well, in Hampshire, as I was living at the time, that we don't really believe ADHD exists after the age of 16 because that's our provision. And he offered me a test at the local psychiatric hospital for, I think of the word for it now.
Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's. Yeah, it was an Alzheimer's test, and I thought, well, I don't think I'm quite at that point yet.
That to me, that's like somebody going in with like tonsillitis and being sent for an X-ray for a broken leg. It just doesn't. That's just nuts.
No, it is, and I think there was quite within that health trust at the time, and to be actually honest, that within Hampshire today, if you have adult ADHD and you need to get if you're medicated, as many people are, you need to get a psychiatrist to change the medication. The GP can't do it. It's a 2.5-year wait for an appointment to see a psychiatrist.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah. So you can imagine to get your first diagnosis as an adult is, you're into 3, 4, 5 years now, and it is very much the Aunt Sally of the sort of mental health provision, really.
But you saw a piece by Rory Bremner, and through that you contacted a consultant in London.
Yeah, my partner highlighted a Radio 4 broadcast by Rory Bremner where he talked about his own ADHD, and he also talked to a lot of people, and suddenly there was one of those light bulb moments, and I thought, that sounds correct. And there was a particular professor from the Maudsley Hospital in London who was on the thing, and I was sort of I got hold of his address and wrote a letter just explaining my situation, and he responded, and he actually said, well, I'm going to do something maybe a little bit unconventional. I'm going to send a letter to your GP on a private basis. He said, not as a medical person within inside the NHS, suggesting that they do go out, get the funding, and get you out of county, as they called it, referred to Sussex, who did have the facility. And that was it. And I think I was at the age at that point in time, I was just coming up to 54, 55. And yeah, it was absolutely 100%. I ticked all the boxes. So,
and once you actually had that referral and it was confirmed your diagnosis, was it kind of like a relief moment?
I think there's two-edged sword to that. I think in one regard it is, because you know why certain things have happened. Maybe you put in perspective, a lot of things perhaps earlier in your life that you can relate to. On the other hand, you kind of think, why the hell didn't I get this 50 years ago? Where could I have been with the right support? Albeit that back then in the 60s when I was growing up, it was just naughty children. It wasn't a condition recognised as such. But equally, you obviously have all of those thoughts. But I would say, as always, it was a positive step, no question.
And one final thing that I want to touch on that I personally find quite interesting is that we spoke about how sometimes you struggle a little bit with banter.
Yeah.
Explain that a little bit for me.
I think one of the things that a lot of neurodiversive conditions, whether it's Asperger's or whatever they are, is certain signals, facial signals, not necessarily, but sort of a that banter element, which is a little bit, there's an edge to it, but it's still funny.
Yeah.
You kind of don't get so easily, you don't slip into it so easily, because you tend, I think, with ADHD and other similar conditions, take things quite directly and quite personally. So your natural reaction, I think, is maybe a little bit more extreme result of the banter than somebody that doesn't have the condition. But I live inside it, so it's a bit difficult to answer, but I think that's what it is.
Yeah, and it's harder, I think, from what you were saying, to pick up on the non-verbal cues that make something that could be rude actually funny.
Yeah, I mean, that's a two-way sword, actually, because I think one of the things with ADHD is that due to the pathways in the brain, it's the frontal lobe which is affected by dopamine. You don't necessarily have the control mechanism. That was something I should have mentioned earlier. You don't have the same filter. So there is a likelihood to verge into the inappropriate more readily, not because you're meaning to be inappropriate or rude, it's just that it doesn't occur quite so quickly. It might do to somebody else. So you've got that non-verbal communication two-way element, which is more complex, I think.
It's been fascinating talking to you, and I know that you're happy to be contacted by anybody that has been diagnosed with adult ADHD or think they need some direction to help get diagnosed, and we'll put all your details in the comments. But David, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for being so open about ADHD and helping us understand a bit more.
Well, I was lucky enough to be college governor with special educational needs responsibilities, and what I saw then particularly was such a waste of human capital and talent. So it's we need to maximise the abilities of our people generally and give everybody a fair chance, I think.
Lovely. Thank you very much. You have a great day.